It is the bitter chill of late December 1944. The wind bites through the fog hanging heavy over the snow-covered plains of northern France. The sound of grinding metal and distant gunfire hangs in the air, but it is not from the front lines. Here, on a remote POW camp near the small town of Remembrance, the conflict seems far away. The prisoners, young men in ragged uniforms, shuffle in the mud of their compound. Their faces are gaunt, their eyes hollow from weeks of captivity. Yet, it is the peculiar sight of the German prisoners that will mark this day as a turning point in an otherwise merciless war. On the morning of December 23, 1944, a tense silence envelops the camp as the sounds of the American Guard's boots crunch on the snow. The tension is palpable. After months of cold, grueling deprivation, the men of the German Wehrmacht, now in their American captors' custody, wait uncertainly. But today is different. There is something in the air, something that stirs a flicker of hope, or perhaps resignation. As the American soldiers move through the snow, they are unaware that their actions will soon be met with a gesture that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. An unexpected offering of gratitude from the very men they once faced across the battlefields of Europe. For weeks, the prisoners have been held here under minimal provisions. Their rations small, barely enough to keep hunger at bay. Their limbs are stiff from the cold and the cruel punishment of forced marches. Yet, there is something in the prisoners' camp that remains untamed, something that refuses to be subdued by the misery of their present plight. The camp is eerily quiet, save for the hum of a distant generator and the constant ticking of the cold, ever-persistent clock. The American Guards, hardened men who have faced the horrors of the war on the Western Front, walk briskly as they check the perimeter, their faces strained with the same exhaustion they impose on their prisoners. But today, one man stands apart. Sergeant John Carter, his face unshaven and weary from the endless patrols, has been stationed at this camp for over a month. He is a survivor of the brutal battles of Normandy, the kind of soldier who no longer asks why, simply moves where ordered. Yet, like so many others, he carries with him the weight of the war, the lives lost, the friends gone forever, the cries of the fallen. For Carter and his comrades, the war is a distant thing, a series of missions, of orders, of deaths, and of soldiers sent home in body bags. And yet today, something will change. As the guards move through the cold morning mist, their boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow, Carter notices a strange sound, a murmur, then a whisper. His eyes narrow as he looks toward the fence where the POWs are gathered, their shadows long against the pale light. Then, from the depths of the camp, he hears it clearly, the first tentative notes of a song. The sound is soft at first, hesitant, a slow, haunting melody rising from the German prisoners. For a moment, there is confusion. No one understands what is happening. The song grows louder, filling the silent morning with its strange, foreign tones. The prisoners are singing not the defiant anthems of their homeland, not the bitter oaths of warriors who had once marched across Europe with cold efficiency. No, this is something else entirely. This is a song of mourning, of hope, perhaps even of forgiveness. Carter stands frozen, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He watches as the prisoners' men who had once fought against him, against his comrades, in the thick of battle raise their voices in unison. The song is not just any song. It is an old hymn, a melody passed down through generations, a song of peace, of reconciliation. The cold air shudders as the music swells, each note striking Carter's chest like the thud of a distant artillery shell. It is the strangest thing he has ever heard. He knows that these men, these prisoners, have been fighting for a cause that he had spent so much of his life fighting against. And yet here they are, singing not in defiance, but in sorrow. The sheer weight of the moment sinks into his chest. For a moment, time seems to stop. Carter's hand rests on the cold metal of the fence, his breath rising in visible puffs of white against the backdrop of the pale sky. The snow begins to fall heavier now, each flake dancing in the air like the ghosts of men long past. He listens intently as the song grows stronger, more assured, rising and falling like a living thing. The prisoners' voices are raw, strained by their suffering, but they are undeterred. The hymn swells in the air, an offering of grace from men who have known only the depths of violence. As they sing, the American soldiers, once wary and suspicious, begin to pause. Some lean against the fence. Others stand motionless. Even the officer in charge seems momentarily distracted, his usual harsh demeanor softened by the unexpected power of the song. It is then that Carter realizes something profound. The prisoners, having endured the harshness of their captivity, having been broken down by the ravages of war, have found something within themselves that transcends their differences, their hatred, and their fear. In this moment, the war is not what defines them. It is their shared humanity, their shared experience of suffering, that binds them together. The sound of the hymn fills the cold air, a bridge between enemies, between warriors who have been torn apart by years of battle. The American soldiers begin to stir, exchanging looks of surprise. Carter watches as one by one, the men begin to lower their weapons, their hands shaking slightly. No one speaks. The only sound is the song, ringing out in the bitter cold. It is as if the prisoners' music has broken the invisible barrier that separates them, breaking through the walls of hatred and fear that have held them apart for so long. For the first time, Carter feels something he cannot explain, a flicker of respect, of understanding, and as the final note of the hymn lingers in the air, suspended in the frozen silence, Carter knows that the war, for all its brutality, has left behind something far more powerful than victory or defeat. In that moment, there is only the music, and the strange bond it has forged between captor and captive. But as the last echoes of the song fade, another sound emerges from the camp, a low rumble, distant but growing louder. Carter's heart skips a beat. In the stillness, something shifts. The storm of war is far from over. There is always another battle to fight, another sacrifice to be made. And as the men in the camp turn back to their daily grind, the air is thick with the unspoken understanding that no victory, no defeat, will ever erase the memory of what they have just shared. The prisoners have sung, but the song is not yet finished. The American guards, still standing in the snow, begin to turn away. Their boots crunch against the white, the hymn still echoing in their minds. For Carter, the lesson of the day is clear. War can strip a man of his dignity, his strength, and his spirit, but it can never take away his ability to speak to others through the language of music, of emotion. For a moment, the prisoners were no longer enemies. They were simply men, bound together by the same trials, the same fear, and the same yearning for peace. As Carter walks away, the sound of the prisoner's hymn still hangs in the air, a haunting reminder of the unlikeliest of victories. But what happens next? What lasting impact does this extraordinary moment have on the men who witnessed it? The answer lies in the battles that will follow, and in the hidden connections forged during the darkest days of the war. What begins in the snowy fields of Remagen will ripple through the hearts of those who survive, echoing long after the final shots are fired. As dawn broke on the 3rd of January 1945, the prisoners at the POW camp in Remagen were already hard at work, their faces pale beneath the weight of endless labor. The song of Christmas long since faded into the bleak routine of captivity. Yet, a strange shift had occurred in the men, and in the guards who watched them. The moment of unexpected harmony, that brief, surreal exchange of music and respect, had set in motion a series of events that would stretch the boundaries of what was expected in a prisoner of war camp. It was not just the simple act of a song that had made an impact, but what it revealed about the deeper forces at play in this larger, ongoing conflict. The prisoners, many of them veterans of the brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front, had already faced hellish conditions. These men, who had been trained to break and subjugate, were now the ones enduring subjugation. Their uniforms, once a symbol of military pride, were now threadbare, their insignias worn away by the harshness of captivity. The snow had become a constant companion, as the weight of frostbitten hands and cold nights made survival feel like an impossible task. But in their bleak existence, the soldiers had found a small solace: the brief, unexpected acknowledgement from their captors. It wasn't much, but it had cracked open a door that no one expected to be there. For Sergeant Carter, the aftermath of that moment was a slow realization. He couldn't shake the melody from his mind. The prisoner's song, despite its foreignness, despite its haunting, unfamiliar chords, had struck something deep within him. He couldn't remember when exactly he'd let his guard down, but in the days that followed, he began to see the prisoners not as the faceless enemy, but as men who had been caught in a larger, unforgiving machine. They were not unlike himself. They had their own stories, their own fears, their own struggles. Carter had spent much of his life seeing the war in black and white terms: victory or defeat, friends or foes. But the song, those moments of shared humanity, had blurred the lines. And so, in the weeks that followed, Carter began to observe the men in the camp more closely. The rations were still scarce, and the work was grueling. The guards, still keeping a tight watch over the prisoners, were no less hardened by the war. But there was something different now. As Carter walked through the camp, he noticed the prisoners whispering among themselves, their voices muted, yet there was a new unity among them. They were speaking less about escape or resistance, and more about survival. They were quietly, almost imperceptibly, shifting their attention to one another in a way that had not been seen before. Across the compound, a group of prisoners huddled together, not in secret, but in plain sight of their captors. There was a sense of calm, of purpose. They no longer seemed like a broken, disheartened mass of men who had surrendered to their fate. Instead, they had begun to rebuild something within their own community, an internal structure that had long been absent. It was as if the song had not only momentarily united them with their captors, but had also ignited a spark of defiance that transcended the prison's fences. In the weeks leading up to the Allies' breakthrough at the Battle of the Bulge, the POW camp was increasingly under the scrutiny of American command. Their concern was understandable. These prisoners, once part of a terrifyingly effective fighting machine, were now gathering in ways that could prove dangerous. There was even talk of relocating the camp, of breaking up the prisoners' newfound unity before it could evolve into something more. But for Carter, the new developments were not troubling. They were revealing. He understood what was happening. He understood the psychological toll of captivity, the slow process of breaking down men's spirits, only to see them rise again, unexpectedly, in the most human of ways. He knew that these prisoners were not just resisting in the physical sense, they were resisting mentally and emotionally. They were no longer just surviving. They were trying to reclaim some part of themselves that had been lost in the chaos of war. The guards, too, began to notice the shift. Where once there had been tension and hostility, there was now a tentative sense of cooperation. The prisoners no longer viewed the guards merely as captors to be outwitted or subdued. The Americans, who had long been seen as the enemy, were slowly transformed into something else in the prisoners' eyes: protectors, however reluctant. The men in the camp, once so distant and unapproachable, were beginning to acknowledge their shared plight. A bond, unspoken yet undeniable, was forming between them. Yet, despite this fleeting sense of camaraderie, there was still war in the air. The guards and prisoners both knew that the brutality of the conflict was not over, that the promise of peace was still distant. Still, that bond, forged in song and mutual suffering, remained a fragile thread that would tie the fates of captor and captive together, even as the war continued to rage on outside the camp's wire fences. It wasn't until February 1945, as the tide of the war shifted, that the true weight of this moment would be fully realized. With the Allied forces closing in on the Rhine, the prisoners in Remagen were on the cusp of something unexpected. Their captors, unable to prevent the inevitable advance of the U.S. Army, found themselves questioning their own survival, just as the prisoners had once done. The war was no longer just a matter of advancing lines and shifting frontiers. It had become something more, a battle for the soul, for identity, and for survival against a backdrop of destruction. And so, in the final weeks of the war, the song that had first echoed in the snow would continue to reverberate, not just in Remagen, but across the battlefield. It had become more than just a momentary gesture. It was a turning point for the men in that POW camp, and for the soldiers who had once guarded them. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the times, there was always room for something greater, a hope, a flicker of humanity even in the darkest of hours. And as the war drew to a close, the impact of that single song would resonate in the hearts of those who had been its unlikely audience. As the war drew to its bloody and inevitable conclusion in the spring of 1945, the effects of the song sung by the German POWs in Remagen continued to echo far beyond the confines of the camp. The prisoners who had once been part of a vast, organized war machine, a collective force driven by the ruthlessness of their commanders, now stood in stark contrast to the machines of war they had built and fought for. The American guards, who had once viewed them with contempt and suspicion, had witnessed a fleeting moment of commonality, of humanity. But the real legacy of this event, of that one song, shared between captor and captive, would reveal itself in the months and years that followed. For the German POWs, the song was not merely a symbol of surrender, but an act of defiance, a testament to their ability to retain their humanity in the face of unimaginable hardship. Captivity had stripped away their uniforms, their insignia, their identity as soldiers, but it could not strip away their ability to express what it meant to be human. Even in the midst of suffering, they had found a way to assert their dignity, to remind the world and their captors that they were not mere automatons of war. They were men. They had hopes, fears, regrets, and, most of all, they had the ability to remember a time before the war, when music, not bloodshed, had defined their lives. For Sergeant Carter, the moments spent in the camp after the prisoners had sung were moments of introspection. He found himself contemplating the nature of victory and defeat. It was clear that the Allies were on the verge of winning the war. But what did that victory truly mean? What would the world look like after the guns had fallen silent, after the dust had settled? He couldn't help but think back to the moment the prisoners had sung. In that instant, he had seen something rare, a glimpse of what the war had taken from both sides. The prisoners were defeated, but they had not been destroyed. And the soldiers, too, had fought hard to survive, but they had not emerged unscathed. Victory on the battlefield, Carter realized, was only one part of the equation. The real cost of war would be paid not in territory gained or lost, but in the psychological scars left on those who fought it. As the war wound down, the men who had been prisoners of the Third Reich were now part of a new struggle, a struggle to redefine themselves in a world that had shifted beneath their feet. The images of their former lives, of marching across the fields of Poland and France, of standing proud as part of an army that once seemed unstoppable, had all been shattered. The dream of a 1,000-year empire had crumbled, and the reality of their defeat had set in. Now, they were forced to reckon with the lives they had led and the choices they had made. The war had stripped them of their past, and they had little choice but to begin again. In the case of the American soldiers, the song had planted a seed of doubt, a questioning of the simple narrative that had once justified the war. It had been easy to see the Germans as the enemy, to paint them with the same brush of hate and fear that had fueled the conflict. But now, that same brush was being questioned. The prisoners, who had once been faceless enemies, were now human beings again. The war had not simply been about armies and generals, but about men and their souls, about the destruction of the human spirit. And in that moment, as the POWs had sung their mournful tune, it was clear that no one, not even the victors, would leave the war unscathed. The aftermath of the war, especially in Europe, was a long, painful rebuilding process. For many, the physical scars of war were easy to see. The crumbled cities, the bombed-out landscapes, the fields strewn with the remnants of artillery shells and burnt vehicles. But the emotional scars, the trauma that lingered long after the ceasefires had been signed, were less visible, but no less real. The men who had been prisoners in Remagen would return to their homes in Germany, to a country that had been ravaged by war. They would rebuild their lives, but they would never fully escape the memories of what they had lost, what they had been forced to do, and what they had seen. Sergeant Carter, too, would return home. He would leave behind the cold fields of northern France and the mud-splattered streets of Remagen, but he would never forget the faces of the prisoners who had sung their song. The war had taught him many things, but the most important lesson was that war was not a simple matter of right and wrong, of heroes and villains. It was a brutal, heartbreaking conflict that ravaged not just bodies, but hearts and minds. The American soldiers, too, would carry the weight of the war with them in their memories, in their relationships, and in the quiet moments when they would find themselves questioning the decisions they had made. The story of the POWs in Remagen, of the moment they shared a song with their captors, would not become a widely known tale of wartime heroism. It would not appear in the history books, and it would not be celebrated on the silver screen. But for those who had lived through it, the memory would persist. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, there was the possibility of something greater, the possibility of redemption, of understanding, and of humanity. The men who sang in that cold, snow-covered camp had given more than just a song. They had given a glimpse of the human spirit, a spirit that could not be broken by the machinery of war. And in the years that followed, as the world moved further from the Second World War, the memory of those brief moments of connection would serve as a reminder to all that in the end, it was not the weapons that won the war, nor the battles fought in the name of victory. It was the simple acts of humanity, the shared experiences, and the fleeting moments of understanding between enemies that left the deepest mark. Because even in the most brutal of conflicts, the song of mankind could still be heard, and that song would be passed down through generations, forever etched into the history of the war that had changed the world.